Hi, welcome to our daily encounter. In Proverbs 31, we have the words of King Lemuel, which was actually an oracle which his mother had taught him. And in this chapter, we have a section on what is called the Virtuous Wife. And this covers verses 10 through the end of the chapter. And you almost get the idea that this is his mother basically telling him what type of wife he should be looking for. And you have supposedly a fictitious woman here presented, but she's presented in such a way as to show the good characteristics that a wife ought to have. Now, in talking to women in the past, a lot of them look at this section with a lot of reverence and with a really wholehearted desire to be like this virtuous wife. But for a lot of women, it's actually a discouragement, because they look at this section and they say, wow, there is no way I could ever be like this wife. Some of these things, some of these details in this section might seem a little bit difficult for a woman in our society to do. Talking about looking for wool and flax. She brings her food from afar. She rises also while it is still night. For some, that seems a bit overwhelming. She considers a field and buys it. From her earnings, she plants a vineyard. Talks about her stretching her hands to the distaff and her hands grasp the spindle. She makes her own clothing for herself and for her children. And some women read these various details of this virtuous wife, and they seem like they seem a bit overwhelmed, and they're like, how could I ever be like this woman? But what I would encourage you to do as you read this section is not to get so caught up in the details, but to look at the characteristic that is being displayed in the details. Because in our society, in 21st century America, most likely there's not going to be wives out there who are spinning material and making fabric for themselves and for the children and for their household, or buying a field and planting a vineyard, things along those lines. You may not ever do those things, but you might be able to emulate the characteristic, the character that's behind those particular things described in this section. For instance, this is a woman who is trustworthy, and all women can be trustworthy. In chapter 31 and verse 11, it says, the heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. He trusts her. And basically, you get the picture that this is a guy who is able to go out, and as you read later, he was a person who sits at the gates. He could go out and sit at the gate and probably was there as a figure, authoritative figure, perhaps deciding judgments between people and stuff. But he could go out to work and know that things were being taken care of by his wife. And he didn't have to worry about what she was doing or where she was going or who she was with. He trusts her. His heart fully trusts her. And a good wife, a virtuous wife, is going to be one that her husband can trust. She's also going to be a well-intentioned wife as well. In verse 12 it says, she does him good and not evil all the days of her life. She only does what is good for her husband. She has good intentions for her husband. And we look in our society, and a lot of wives don't have that type of attitude. Many times in a marriage there's a power struggle, and the wife is sometimes trying to bring the husband down, and maybe she speaks with ill will towards him, and maybe puts him down in front of other people, makes jokes about him, and really brings him down to a low level. And not only that, just there could be a lot of different ways in which a wife might really seek evil for her husband instead of good. But a virtuous wife is only going to seek good for her husband. She only wants to build him up. She only wants to help him to improve, to become better, and to do well in life, and to do whatever she can to support him in that. Also, a virtuous wife is going to be very hardworking. We see this a lot in this section, and perhaps this is a characteristic that is brought out the most. In verse 13, it says, she looks for wool and flax and works with her hands in the light. And there's many other verses that lend themselves to this. In verse 17, she girds herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She's just a very hardworking woman. She wakes up before daylight and she goes to bed way after nightfall. Just working hard, tending to things, and making sure everything gets done. This is a virtuous woman, very hardworking. But she's also very practical as well. It says in verse 16, she considers a field and buys it, and from her earnings she plants a vineyard. She's able to make decisions, and here somewhat of a business decision in being able to find a field to buy. She probably got it at a good price, and plants a vineyard to make a profit and to bring gain into her family, into the household, so that they would be well provided for. And so she's very practical, very able to make practical decisions on her own. She's also a generous woman as well. It says in verse 19, she stretches out her hands. In verse 20, she extends her hand to the poor, and she stretches out her hands to the needy. And so she's a person who's very, very generous. She is able to give money, and because she is so practical, and because she was able to make profit, she probably had money left over to give to the poor. But she was willing to do that as she had opportunity, and a virtuous wife will be that way. She's also very prudent, being able to look into the future. In verse 25, it says, strength and dignity are her clothing, and she smiles at the future. In verse 21, she is not afraid of the snow for her household, for all her household are clothed with scarlet. She's a person who looks ahead, looks at the future, prepares for the future. She's very prudent. In verse 25, when it says she smiles at the future, I believe there it's not just that she has an optimistic attitude and that she's just a happy-go-lucky person. She's able to smile at the future because she's hardworking, she's dedicated, she's preparing things for the future to make sure that everything is in place for future need. That's why she's able to smile at the future, not just because she's a happy-go-lucky person necessarily. But she's also a very supportive person as well, probably very supportive of her husband. As we look also in this section, it says in verse 23, her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. Now you might think, well, what control does she have over what position her husband holds? And the only thing that I can see of why this is included in this section is that she played a part in her husband having that position. She very likely is a type of wife who is very supportive of him, did whatever she could to make sure that he did succeed, by making sure that everything was taken care of as far as the household was concerned and other affairs that she took care of. He didn't have to worry about those things, and he could focus on being a leader in the community. And so she was a very strong support for him. And I strongly believe that if you look at any successful man and any man who's done really well for himself, 9 times out of 10 he has a wife that was there and helped him get to the place that he got to. We as men, we very much lean on our wives to help us, support us, to encourage us, and to, in some cases, to push us to improve. And so a virtuous wife is going to do that for her husband, and as a result, he's going to be a person of high position in a lot of cases. She is also very dignified. It says this about her. It says that she is very dignified, and that's a characteristic that perhaps is lost in many of the women in today's society. There's not a lot of dignity in the women. They cannot be described as, this woman is described in verse 25 as strength and dignity being their clothing. It used to be that women were very dignified. As a matter of fact, when men were talking, they were very careful not to use curse words around a woman, around a lady. And nowadays, in a lot of cases, the woman is saying just as bad, if not worse, words than the men are. And there's just no sense of dignity. There's no sense of staying away from things that are vulgar or filthy or improper. There's no more sense of dignity, it seems like, in a lot of cases. I'm not saying in all cases. There are a lot of women out there that are very dignified and exemplify this characteristic, but in some cases that's not the case. And so if you want to be a virtuous wife, one of the things you got to have is dignity. She's also a woman of fine speech. In verse 26, she opens her mouth in wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. You can tell that she's a virtuous woman not only by all these outside actions that she does, but also because of the words that she speaks. She is able to speak wisdom, and not only speak wisdom, but speak it with kindness. It says the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. And so she's able to speak these words, and people can come and listen to her and gain wisdom and knowledge. And lastly, she is a woman who is praiseworthy. In verse 28 it says, her children rise up and bless her, her husband also, and he praises her, saying, many daughters have done nobly, but you excel them all. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. Give her the product of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. So this could kind of sum up all the characteristics, right? You know, she has all of these wonderful virtues, and all of these kind of work together to make her a praiseworthy woman. A woman that people look up to, respect, speak well of, because she is living the life of not only wisdom, but of great character. And so as we look back, and as we look at this section, these are some characteristics that a woman can have if she wants to be a virtuous wife. And I would even say, you know, if there's any men listening in, that these are also characteristics that we should have as well. Trustworthy, well-intentioned, hardworking, practical, generous, prudent, supportive, dignified, full of fine speech, and praiseworthy. Just think about a person who can exemplify all these characteristics. Surely they would be a person who is pleasing to the Lord and helpful to their fellow man. Well, thank you for listening in today. I hope you guys have a great day. I love you guys. God bless.